Good morning, everyone, and welcome. It's great to have so many people on the call. I'm going to be talking about working with informality rather than working on or about informality, and I hope that emphasis on the with really comes through. I also hope that this presentation and the paper will be a kind of catalyst for a discussion rather than just something with a Q&A at the end, because there's so much expertise on this call. I don't think this presentation or paper should dominate it. Anyway, I'm going to start from the end of the paper with this statement that if we are to meet people where they are in their food systems that are doing the heavy work of food and nutrition security for the poor, then informality cannot be an excuse for continued underinvestment of attention and resources, building on what Bart just said. That's the end point. That's the kind of imbalance that I hope we'll be addressing. And I really want to stress the fact that this is not a sort of personal discovery. This has been based on many partnerships with many other organizations, including with HEVOS, programs on small producers and sustainable diets, with More Milk, with ILRI, and an internal IIED learning exercise on value chains, a recent event we co-hosted at Bellagio, as well as SNB with partnership that goes back to some work on inclusive business models. So that's I'm a magpie rather than a genius in terms of ideas. I also want to share the fact that SNB and IIED both have a common background in this, which is that agriculture and food is our entry point here to informality. And that's why we are both relative latecomers compared to groups working on in the urban space who have been familiar with informality for many, many, many years. But we have had to rethink our strategies of value chain based development towards trying to understand food systems of the majority, or the food systems of the poor, and also rethink the role of our organizations in this push for food systems transformation. And that, I think, the agriculture and food entry point gives us a different perspective on informality that straddles both rural and urban, and the whole provision of food from primary producers to low-income consumers. I also want to stress the fact, and this comes across, I hope, in the paper, that there are two framings of informality which I think are both correct. One is that informality is an unregulated, micro-entrepreneurial sector or economy that's not recognized, not recorded, not regulated by the state, but of course heavily regulated elsewhere. And it's also a logic that people use to survive. It's a resourceful behaviors, it's innovations that might be legal, that may be unauthorized, or might be criminal, but driven by poverty, driven by lack of rights, distrust of institutions. And this logic is an expression of agency. So I think if we keep both of those in our heads as I work through this, it'll be useful rather than just think of a classic sectoral or definition of informality. And let's also understand these different ideas of food system transformation. This is where I started, and I think this is where SNV started, that you have an upstream of small-scale producers, you have a downstream that is undergoing a lot of changing in terms of manufacturing and retail and food service that's industrializing, that's concentrating, that's modernizing, that's globalizing and getting a lot of investment. And that change in downstream bit of the food system has to be understood, and that we need to try and bring small farmers along with that change to link worlds through cooperation to compete in the market, inclusive business models, contracts, value chain development, and new types of finance. That's where we've come from. But there's another, while we drive to these projects on inclusive business and look through the windows of our cars, and we see the other food system that people have, that's more endogenous, that people have built, and that's going on despite rather than because of projects. And I think we could look at it at this and another view of food systems transformation that includes a midstream that Bart and colleagues have also focused on, that things are changing in the countryside with emerging urban centers which are creating trading and logistics hubs, that's bringing the market closer to farmers, that's redirecting production to domestic markets where trade is becoming more competitive, it's crossing borders, it's supported by mobile phones and mobile money. There are assembly markets booming in larger towns, and an entrepreneurial SME-dominated processing sector. And downstream, there's urbanization, and not just in megacities, it's smaller settlements that are growing faster. There's informal settlements. That industrialization may be weak, so the informal economy has to be and is absorbing a lot of entry into the labor market with important roles of youth in informality. And of course, there's a dietary transition with the growth of processed and prepared food, much of it driven by necessity rather than changes in preference. So that is driving another kind of food system transformation that doesn't have much to do with donors. It doesn't have much to do with NGO projects, with subsidies or direct government involvement, but it does have quite a lot to do with investment in transport and energy infrastructure. This is the kind of transformation that I concentrate most in the paper, and I won't go into much of it now because I want to talk more about how partnerships with the informal food systems work. So informal food systems have taken a permanent place in the provision of livelihoods and food for poor people. This is not simply a poorer version of formal food systems. It's feeding most people in poverty at scale and able to grow without large corporate structures. It's reorganizing food distribution from exports to domestic supply. It's highly entrepreneurial and dynamic. There are important roles for women and youth. It's not just completely informal, but there's a dynamic exchanges between the informal and formal economy. And for the point of view of policy and both private and public policy, it puts food systems outside or partly outside the governance of states and value chains. So this whole thing is central to food system transformation and achieving the SDGs, but the toolkit of food systems transformation is largely focused on formalization through regulation, inclusion in value chains, organization in markets, and cutting out the middleman. It's also viewed negatively, widely negatively, as a hindrance to modernization, as a barrier to revenue generation by governments, a threat to civic order and public health, and unfair competition that constrains the development of a formal private sector. And on the other side of that is a big distrust of authority within the informal food economy. So this is a tricky area, and made particularly tough by the fact that this is a lot of it, especially downstream in the urban and peri-urban world, is acting in a grey area that is susceptible to what has been called dysregulation. That's regulatory ambiguity at the edge of legality, which opens it all up to arbitrary application of the law to protect business interests or extract rent, but also creates some flexibility for regulation and innovation. This is linked to resistance to outsiders in the informal food economy, and a resistance to government regulation and enforcement, which can importantly extend to international NGOs and their projects, who may be seen as part of that whole kind of external intervention world, and also a resistance to visibility or legibility. So, yeah, and this can be can deter investment and growth of informal enterprises. Now, I don't want to talk much about the performance of informal food enterprises. That's covered also a lot in the paper, but there's a couple of areas which are very important and which are a bit short of research and knowledge. One is resilience, and that was tested recently by COVID and the range of responses to COVID by different countries, and there's been some nice research by Riego on this, and it shows that responses have to the informal food system has ranged from closing markets and harassing vendors to treating them as essential workers, the whole range of spectrum there, and in some cases led to reducing the availability of nutritious food and impacting employment and poverty. So as we get into the climate debate, this aspect of resilience and informality is super important but under-researched. The second one is food safety, which is the biggest challenge facing informal food systems and the biggest stick with which to beat the informal food system, the most significant contributor to criminalization. There's evidence that risk can be managed and is being managed by even hazardous products like fresh milk and meat. Perceptions of high risk are not always warranted, and assumptions of superior performance in formal systems just because something is in a supermarket or wrapped in packaging are not always matched by reality. There's some excellent work by Ilri and by Didier, by colleagues. I think we have at least one on the call today on this area. Now, what about formalization? Formalization is the classic response to informality, but it can be important to drive out illegal practices such as indentured labor, but formalization can be a poor fit to poor people's reality. It can price informal food systems out of the market, and even famous light touch approaches such as relocation of street vendors, when you go back and look, they can struggle to achieve lasting impact. A lot of this is very paternalistic and is done in the name of inclusion or increased agency, when people are already included under their own terms through their own enterprise. Now, there's we risk inaction and we risk action. Inaction by hoping that the whole thing is going to be eclipsed by structural transformation. We risk rushing to action ahead of understanding of how poor people and informal entrepreneurs maneuver to feed themselves and get things done. And we wish rushing to formalization and a reliance on formal regulations, when maybe informality is not undermining the current and future capacity of food systems to deliver. I have 5 minutes left, and I'm going to have to rattle through this last bit. But working with informality and is easier said than done. Informal actors are concerned about exposure of failure to comply with regulations. They may be wary of bringing a controlling state into their enterprise. They may not want to be given a voice. Their autonomy will be hard won and with strong aspects of self-governance. And they are busy entrepreneurs working on narrow margins. So simply turning up and trying to engage informal actors in your project or your initiative is rarely going to work. The same thing applies to development organizations who have big administrative barriers to taking risks of partnering with informal entrepreneurs, and their country partners may not be the best position to partner with informal actors. Local governments see informality as a big hindrance to modernization or a source of rent that they like to keep, keep informal for that reason. Governments can be suspicious of the external funding that supports informal and perhaps what they see as subversive aspects of the economy. Donor agencies are uncomfortable to invest in this area as they see it as an impediment to the development of a formal private sector. And also, it seems a poor fit to the green economy and sustainable food agendas. So this is a prickly, tricky area to partner with. So I at the end of the paper, I come up with some recommendations which overlap a bit, but which caution against rushing in with projects and initiatives. These partnerships are going to be critically important before anything can be sustained or successful. I first of all suggest that we work with existing energy and hotspots, including local authorities and organizations of informal food actors who are trying to build new ways of working with informality rather than against. And I know I'm from a research group, and I'm always going to sort of emphasize evidence generation, maybe too much, but we need to recognize what informal systems are already doing well before seeking to transform them or set up new businesses and new projects. Evidence on what they are contributing to affordability, to nutrition, to adaptability and resilience, to decent work for women and youth, to the environment and inclusive economic growth. So well done to Wageningen for the case studies that are being commissioned. We need to be prepared to protect those capabilities rather than just do new stuff, and check our preconceptions before targeting an intervention. We need to work constructively with informality, supporting leaders with planning, with infrastructure, with food handling skills, and to support the capacity to defend what is working and improve what is not, using evidence, advocacy, and organization rather than just a defensive type of lobbying. If we can, if the informal food sector, for example, can demonstrate its its contribution to food and nutrition security of low-income workers and citizens, what that's much more powerful as a lobbying tool. And lastly, we need to take a wide view of policy, especially for food safety, not just relying on formal regulations, but directing advocacy to local governments that protects the food security and livelihoods that informal markets offer, around a shared responsibility and some facilitating in structure that supports compliance of existing informal systems. And we need to understand trust-based regulation to better build on it. How are people trading and managing risks, for example, in perishable and potentially hazardous products? There's fantastic things already going on in that respect. Right, that's all I wanted to say, and I hope, as I said, that can stimulate some wider discussion and experiences from all the brains we have on the call